All right, this PowerPoint is dealing with just some particular critiques of utilitarianism, as well as some thought experiments related to utilitarianism, and so on. As usual, we have the motif of archery, of aiming and shooting, and of there being a bullseye, there being a mark, a telos, towards which our actions are supposed to move. Here is a chart that you're going to see throughout the semester continually. And I promise you, you will know this chart by heart before the semester is over. So with ethical theories, they divide into two columns. On the left are ethics of conduct, and on the right, as you can see, are ethics of character. Conduct means what should we do? Character means what should I be? So the first one on the left with utilitarianism looks past the act itself to the outcome. So utilitarianism, that's Bentham and Mills, says, what should I do in this given situation? Well, what will produce the outcome that I desire? Deontology doesn't care really about outcomes for the most part. Deontology is concerned with one's duty and identifying one's duty, and there's a special way that it does it by some categorical understandings, and we'll look at that. So it looks at your duty, and before one acts, one says, what is my duty in this situation? With a good will, one says that. When we deal with ethics of character, again, I want to say we're not thinking, what should I do? The emphasis is on thinking, what would it look like for me to be a woman, for me to be a man of character, of virtue in this situation? That's virtue ethics, and we're going to see that. And so we're going to look at this chart quite a bit until you really have, that you know this by heart, what it's saying. This is how we wrapped up the last lecture, and it was just a contrast between Bentham and Mill, very much the same, except that whereas Bentham is concerned with pleasure, Mill is concerned with happiness, and he's given happiness content. It's kind of a robust concept, and it means not just physical pleasure, but pleasures of the mind as well. And whereas Bentham's focused on his hedonic calculus, which is how long is the pleasure going to be, how strong is the pleasure going to be, how long is it going to be, how certain is it that it's going to happen, how soon is it going to happen, what's the likelihood of me getting more of this, what's the likelihood of no more, and how many get to enjoy this pleasure. That's the hedonic calculus. For Mill, he's more qualitative rather than quantitative. He's not doing the hedonic calculus. He's thinking in a broader sense, more holistic, if you like. Bentham is referred to his approach as act utilitarianism, which the emphasis is on the act. For Mill, it's rule utilitarianism, which is not as willing to change society and to change interaction between people as act utilitarianism is. It does want to measure things according to happiness, but he wants to put his brakes on a little bit and say, we need to keep the rules in place, the moral rules in place that have so far produced well-being for people, and change them slowly. Those are really the significant differences between them. That's painting act versus rule utilitarianism with a broom, but it's kind of what is really going on there. Okay, so where is utilitarianism at its best? Well, absolutely in governmental decisions when we're dealing with any kind of a democratic process. And then most especially in military decision-making. I mean, the very nature, if you think about it, of military decision-making is that certain smaller numbers of people sacrifice or at least put themselves in harm's way in order to save much larger cohorts of people. So utilitarianism and utilitarian thought is great for this. We may have a crack unit of specialized troops that if we put their lives at risk, we save 3,000 lives of regular troops. And there's all kinds of scenarios like that you can imagine. The other place where utilitarianism is really good is in the medical field. When we're dealing with limited resources, let's say we're thinking in terms of who gets a lung transplant or who gets a kidney transplant. Utilitarianism is looking at the greatest good for the greatest number of people overall. And so it's very helpful, and it's helpful with the distribution of limited resources. And it needs to be said, utilitarianism typically, I mean, just by itself, just alone, it's kind of, it's neutral in some ways, morally neutral, and has the potential to be hijacked and taken in a bad or a good direction. It doesn't have the Kantian emphasis on a good will built into the system. But I want to say I have known utilitarians who are incredibly self-sacrificing individuals and who are concerned with the greater good for the greater number of people to the degree that they would sacrifice of themselves. And I've also known utilitarians who have used utilitarian reasoning in very selfish ways. So it's got the potential to go in one direction or another. In its worst case scenario, it could look quite Machiavellian, like the ends justifies the means, ultimately. But it needs to be said, I've worked with some colleagues in the philosophy department who are incredibly giving and sacrificial individuals because they're thinking in terms of the greater good for the greater number of people philosophically, like that's the way they live their life. Okay, so here's some well-known thought experiments regarding utilitarian calculus and how we should approach it. So here, Philippa Foot was a well-known philosophy professor at Oxford University. Actually, my external examiner for my PhD was Roger Trigg, who was an Oxford professor and also a professor at Warwick in England. And Philippa Foot was his mentor and his teacher across the years. So Philippa Foot came up with the trolley problem in order to deal with really a different issue. The issue was the concept of double effect. And I'm not going to get into double effect here, but she contrasted the trolley problem with another picture, a thought experiment that she gave in order to show how double effect works. But anyway, here's her thought experiment that she gives us. It says a trolley, so a trolley's not like flying down a track. This is not a bullet train. A trolley might move at 30 miles an hour. Trolley's running out of control down a track. In its path, there are 5 people who've been tied to the track. Fortunately, you can hit a button, or you can flip a switch, or you can move a big handle that's built into the track, which will send the trolley down a different track to safety. Unfortunately, there's a single person tied to that track. Should you hit the button or do nothing? And 90% of people say, go ahead and hit the button or move the switch or whatever, and send them down the track. And of course, they're not happy about doing that, but it seems like 1 life being lost versus 5 lives being lost is preferable to 1. There's a whole lot of things that could come into play here. It could be that the 5 who are on the tracks, these are serial killers, and the one on the other track is a brain surgeon or a pediatric heart surgeon or something, or a family member of yours. There's all this experimentation that goes on with this. But if this remains just generic, all things being equal, they're all 6 of them strangers and they're of comparative value to one another, for most people it's a no-brainer. For 90% of people it's a no-brainer. Throw the switch and save 5 lives versus saving 1 life. And so it's pretty easy to do. So along comes Judith Jarvis Thomson, who later on in the course you're going to deal with Judith Jarvis Thomson with a thought experiment of hers with regard to abortion. But this is her thought experiment called Spur. So as opposed to the trolley problem, this is Spur. So it's a tweak of the trolley problem. She says a trolley is running out of control down a track towards 5 people. You're on a bridge under which it will pass, and you can stop it by dropping a heavy weight in front of it. And as it happens, there's a very fat man next to you. He's presumably sufficiently large to stop the train. Your only way to stop the trolley is to push him over the bridge and onto the track, killing him to save 5. Should you push the fat man onto the track? So the claim is that the first one and the second one are largely the same issue. And so why is it that we feel comfortable, 90% of us feel comfortable with throwing the switch in the first, but most of us feel uncomfortable with pushing the fat man? Joshua Green is an American experimental psychologist and a neuroscientist and a philosopher. He's got his hands in a lot of different pots here. And he's written a book that I've read in the past, I've used in my classes before, Would You Push the Fat Man? He's professor of psychology at Harvard University, and he has been doing what he calls trolleyology for pretty much 2 decades now. And when he puts these problems before people, when he puts the trolley problem and then when he puts Spur before them, he's done it with thousands and thousands of people, but for some of them he's had their brains be able to be scanned by an fMRI. And what they discovered is that the first of these 2 thought experiments is rather impersonal in nature. where the second one's personal. You're literally grabbing hold of somebody. If they're really fat, how do you get them over the side in the first place? Grab them by the ankles? Who knows? But you're doing something personal. So the impersonal part of our brain, as far as when we're making just decisions, we're the center of reasoning for decisions that are the sort that utilitarianism accounts for, would go on in the prefrontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So it's the center of reasoning where, among other things, we weigh up the costs and the benefits of black and white moral issues and decision making. And so that's where the part of the brain that's being tapped into when we're dealing with the trolley problem itself. It seems rather impersonal. It seems easy to say, well, the calculus here is 5 lives versus 1 life. But when we start dealing with the issue of pushing somebody off of a bridge, now it becomes more personal. So the amygdala is the place where the interface takes place of your emotions and your logic in the brain. Emotions are due in the thought experiment of Spur, of pushing him off. They're due to personal elements and to the empathy or sympathy that we might feel towards the fat man that we're pushing off of the bridge. So quite literally, the thing why it feels so odd to hear the first one of these examples given and have it be, oh yeah, just flip the switch, but then have the second one given and you think, no, I wouldn't do that. And it's like, well, why? They're not that dissimilar. It's because with the personal involvement in the second one, the amygdala is now coming into play, and your emotions are having a lot to do with the decision you make. If you were a psychopath, you just would only reason with the prefrontal cortex. You wouldn't have to really deal with your emotions. But most of us are going to feel that cognitive dissonance between the trolley problem itself from Philippa Foot and Spur from Judith Jarvis Thomson. So this is Judith Jarvis Thomson's. This is just a picture of how that one works. And my students always ask, how do you know it's going to stop the train? Well, it's meant to be that these are simple, and so it's kind of a guaranteed thing that it's supposed to stop the train. So this next thought experiment is one that comes from the beloved philosopher Bernard Williams. I've already talked about this stuff. Bernard Williams. Williams gives this example. He says, this thought experiment. Jim's an explorer who stumbles into a South American village where 20 Indians are about to be shot. The captain of the federales says that as a mark of honor to Jim as a guest, he'll be invited to shoot one of the Indians and the other 19 will be set free. If Jim refuses, all 20 Indians will be shot. What should Jim do? And this is a whole lot more complex than just throw the switch for the 5 versus the 1, for sure. And also, it's you doing the shooting. You're not flipping a switch, you're actually doing shooting. And however you answer this, the way that Williams says that we should respond to this is we don't have enough information. We just don't have enough information. We don't know if this captain is somebody who's going to keep his word. We don't know if he's really going to shoot these 20 Indians or if he's telling us he's going to shoot these Indians. We don't know if perhaps we'll shoot one and then they're going to shoot all 19 anyway, but now we're going to share in the guilt of them having been shot. What one hopes is that perhaps one of them would come forward and say, shoot me, so that the rest of my friends won't be shot, that kind of thing. But what Bernard Williams says with this thought experiment is you don't really have enough information. So this one is one that's a scenario that's played out in movies across time, and it's wartime, and you're hiding in a basement with several other people, and the enemy soldiers are outside. This has also been done with Native American people fleeing from the cavalry and hiding someplace, same kind of a scenario put forward. So the enemy soldiers are right where they could hear you if there's a lot of noise, and your baby starts to cry loudly. And if nothing is done, the soldiers will find you and kill you, your baby, and everyone else in the basement. The only way to prevent this from happening is to cover your baby's mouth, but if you do this, the baby will smother to death. Is it morally permissible to do this? So save all of our lives at the expense of the baby suffocating. And again, of course, it's your baby, and so the personal part of that's coming into there, and you can't just reduce it down to a calculus. The amygdala is involved in this, and I get interesting different responses from students. My male students seem to be much more willing to suffocate the baby than my female students, because the female students tend to think in terms of it being my baby. And there's, we could spend a lot of time on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Here's one that actually took place in real life. I was in the country Jordan in the year that the Charlie Hebdo shootings took place. And so as we're coming home on the airplane, everybody's talking about Charlie Hebdo. I didn't know what Charlie Hebdo was. So Charlie Hebdo is a newspaper in France. And what this says, that's a picture, a depiction that I guess was taken by some as that was supposed to be Muhammad. And the line is 100 cuts or whips of the lash if you are not dying of laughter. That you're going to be dying of laughter from having read what's inside here. And some men saw this and they took offense at this. And so they came to Charlie Hebdo, where it's located. January 7th, 2015, Corinne Ray, a cartoonist at the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, and known by the name Coco, returned from picking up her daughter from kindergarten. So she has her daughter with us. She's going back to work, and she's confronted by two French jihadist gunmen who threatened to shoot her daughter unless she keyed in the entry code at the door for the magazine. She did, and the gunmen entered to murder 12 people, including 2 policemen, as well as shooting 11 others. That's a lot of damage that took place there. So you take the 12 and the 11, that's 23. And 20 of those 23 people, 2 of the ones who were killed were policemen. During the attack, the shooters said they would not kill women, but that they needed to convert to Islam and wear a veil. Of course, she was a woman. So here's the question, if we think in terms of the real world and the kind of thing that's being put before us as far as what would utilitarian reasoning look like in the real world. Should Corinne Ray have been willing to sacrifice her daughter and herself rather than allow obvious murderers to enter the magazine, the premises of the magazine, and possibly kill everyone? Well, when it's this woman and they're going to shoot your daughter, and you don't know what the outcome is, maybe they're going to go in and threaten with the guns, it's pretty obvious that the natural thing that people are going to do is protect their family. Utilitarianism works great in theory, but now when you're confronted with the greatest good for the greatest number of people and your family is on the line, it's a whole lot different. Can a mother be blamed for only thinking of protecting her child? I think most of us would grant no, that she cannot be. So this is a thought experiment that Bernard Williams, the one with you're Jim and you're the explorer in the jungle and you come across these Indians who are going to be shot and so on. This is one of his thought experiments as well. He said if a plane had crashed and you could only rescue your own child or 2 other people's children, which would you rescue? Should you save 2 other people's kids? So you're saving 2 versus 1, which is yours. And again, I mean, it wouldn't matter if you had 5, I don't think, other people's children versus your child. This is what Bernard Williams calls, in response to utilitarian calculus, one thought too many. You shouldn't have to think about this. This is your family, and it's a natural, normal thing as a human being that you would care for your family first. Okay, before we get to the critiques of utilitarianism, I'm going to do this with every one of these theories. Remember, our first class participation grade is going to be given this week. It's not on Friday, it's on Wednesday, or on Thursday on the 24th, I think. So under discussion on Canvas, there's a discussion called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's by the really well-known science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, and it also deals with utilitarian kind of thought. And it's worth double class participation points, so not 25 but 50. If you're concerned about your potential participation grade for this first part of the semester, it's broken up into 4 quarters. If you do that discussion, it's going to give you a boost in your grade. Okay. As long as you do it decently. So here's some criticisms of utilitarianism. First, it's too simplistic. It deals only in happiness and quantities thereof, if we're dealing with Mills, or pleasure and quantities thereof, if we're dealing with Bentham. It neglects matters such as justice, goodness, and the rights of individuals, which we naturally think are a part of the ethical process, ethical reasoning. The next objection is it's entirely subjective. Consequently, it omits the idea of true versus false or superficial versus deep happiness. Next criticism, it seeks to avoid metaphysics, ultimate reality, and to be purely scientific, but it has an implicit metaphysics, and that's materialism, meaning that the physical natural world and the things in the physical natural world are what matter most. The focus or emphasis on this world only and its relationships and its goods and those sorts of things is an implicit form of materialism. Then one of the accusations is utilitarianism has a natural tendency towards playing God. The desire to give the greatest good to the greatest number of people has been a driving motivation of numerous so-called social engineers across time, including some of those who've been dictators. So that's one of the worries with regard to it. And then another thing is it cannot tell us why we should act unselfishly. And this is, I think, a valid critique of it. It can't tell you why you should act unselfishly. It presents a calculus, but it gives no true values. So Bertrand Russell embraced this way of reasoning, and both of his daughters, I think I've written about this in one of the things that you'll read for the class, both of his daughters loved their dad, but they found his ability to teach them about right and wrong to be unsatisfactory. They said, Mom could tell us why things were right and wrong, but being told as a little girl that you need the greatest good for the greatest number of people was not particularly helpful. It wasn't something that worked for kids. Then utilitarianism has no classification for evil. What is evil is now what produces the most pain for the largest number of people, and what is good is what produces the most pleasure. So if you're not aware of it, Amnesty International and other groups have come against a practice that was going on in China where people were being executed in stadiums, and this is the law process, and they were harvesting their organs, taking their organs right away and harvesting them. So as you're standing in line to have your case tried, you're seeing people taken and with a surgical team put to death and have their organs harvested. So it was greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is a big nation, and this is wealth for our nation, and so on. But that instinctively troubles a lot of people. And you could use utilitarian thought to try to justify this. So it hasn't got a classification for something like that being evil. What of virtues like honor, loyalty, and honesty that many people feel are good in and of themselves without reference to their consequences? Sometimes telling the truth has bad consequences. Should I become a liar to avoid bad consequences? And so that's another one of the complaints. I think the last one here now. What of human rights and the idea that there are certain courses of action that one cannot take even in the name of the greater good? So these are complaints against utilitarianism, but I do want to re-emphasize utilitarianism is especially helpful in medical and in military type situations, and it has a place in governance overall in any form of a democratic government.